The low rumble of engines shattered the quiet of the roadside cafe. One bike, then another, then 5 more. Chrome glinted under the afternoon sun as a group of bikers rolled in, their leather jackets marked with patches, boots slamming against the pavement like a warning. Conversations inside the cafe slowed. A waitress froze mid-step. Even the air felt heavier. At the corner table near the window sat a man alone. No leather, no rings, no attitude. Just a simple black jacket, faded jeans, and a calm posture that looked almost out of place in a room suddenly full of tension. He sipped his coffee slowly, eyes relaxed, as if the noise meant nothing. One of the bikers noticed him. "Hey," the biker said loudly, nudging another with a grin. "Check this guy out." The group laughed as they walked past his table. One of them deliberately slammed a shoulder into the man, nearly knocking the cup from his hand. Coffee spilled onto the table. "Watch where you're sitting, old man," the biker sneered. The cafe went silent. Everyone waited for the reaction. Anger, fear, apology. That's how it usually went. Men like this didn't get bumped without consequences. But the man simply looked down at the spilled coffee, then slowly looked up. His eyes were calm. Not scared. Not angry. Calm. "I think that was unnecessary," he said quietly. The bikers burst into laughter. "Did you hear that?" one of them mocked. "He thinks he has an opinion." Another biker leaned closer, close enough for the smell of gasoline and leather to fill the man's space. "You alone out here? That's dangerous." A few customers stood up, ready to leave. No one wanted trouble. No one wanted to be involved. The man at the table gently placed his cup down. "I just wanted coffee," he said. "Let's keep it that way." That's when the leader stepped forward. Tall, scar across his cheek. A grin that promised violence. "You don't tell us what to do," he said, slamming his fist on the table. "You apologize, or this gets ugly." The man finally stood. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just steady. For a brief second, something shifted in the room, an instinctive feeling that things were about to go very wrong. The bikers felt it too, though none of them understood why. The man straightened his jacket and looked at them one last time. "This is your last warning," he said calmly. They laughed. They shouldn't have. Because the man they were threatening wasn't weak. Wasn't scared. And what they didn't know, what no one in that cafe knew yet, was that they were standing inches away from Steven Seagal, a man with a black belt in karate, and decades of discipline behind those quiet eyes. The cafe had not always been this tense. Just an hour earlier, it was the kind of place travelers stopped to rest. Truckers sipping black coffee, a tired mother sharing fries with her son, an old man reading yesterday's newspaper near the window. The walls smelled of grease and roasted beans, the jukebox humming softly in the background. Then the bikers arrived. Their engines announced them before the doors even opened. The roar rolled through the parking lot like thunder, rattling the windows and pulling every head toward the entrance. When the doors swung wide, leather and metal filled the room. Heavy boots hit the floor with purpose, like they owned the place the moment they stepped inside. They spread out, loud and confident. One slapped the counter and demanded beer even though it wasn't served. Another laughed too hard at his own joke. A third scanned the room, eyes searching not for food, but for weakness. That was when they noticed the man in the black jacket. He didn't look impressive by their standards. No muscle-flexing shirt. No chains. No visible weapon. He wasn't trying to be noticed at all. He sat straight, calm, hands resting loosely near his cup, gaze unfocused yet aware. Steven Seagal had learned long ago that silence often attracted the loudest kind of trouble. He had chosen this place on purpose, not because it was special, but because it was ordinary. He liked ordinary. Places where no one cared who you were. Places where you could exist without expectations. But arrogance has a way of finding calm. The biker leader nudged one of his men and nodded toward Steven's table. "Look at that guy," he muttered. "Sits like he owns the place." One biker smirked. "Let's see if he's got a voice." They moved closer, their shadows stretching across Steven's table. A few customers noticed and quickly looked away. Experience had taught them that watching only made things worse. Steven felt their presence before they spoke. He didn't turn, didn't tense. He took another slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle. Control started with breath. Always had. "This seat taken?" one biker asked sarcastically, kicking the leg of the chair opposite him. Steven glanced up briefly. "Yes." The simple answer caught them off guard. "What?" the biker laughed. "By who?" "Your imaginary friend." Steven didn't answer. He returned his attention to his cup, as if the conversation had ended. That was mistake number one. The leader stepped forward, planting both hands on the table and leaning in. "You think you're funny," he said. "Because you don't look funny." Steven finally met his eyes. There was no challenge there. No fear either. Just quiet assessment, the kind that weighed distance, balance, and intention in a single glance. "I think," Steven said calmly, "that everyone here wants a peaceful afternoon." The leader scoffed. "This guy thinks he's a philosopher." Laughter erupted behind him. A waitress froze near the counter, unsure whether to call the manager or pretend nothing was happening. A man near the door quietly reached for his phone, then hesitated. He didn't want to be seen recording. Steven slowly pushed his chair back and stood, not to fight, but to create space. He didn't raise his hands, didn't square his shoulders. His movements were smooth, economical, trained. "Sit down," one biker snapped, poking Steven's chest. "You stand when we say so." Steven looked down at the finger pressing into him. "Don't touch me," he said, voice low but steady. For a split second, the leader felt something he couldn't explain, a tightening in his gut, a warning that came too late. This wasn't fear. It was instinct. But ego screamed louder. "You hear that?" the leader said loudly. "He's giving orders now." The bikers closed in, forming a loose circle. Chairs scraped back. Someone knocked over a glass. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pulling inward as tension thickened the air. Steven exhaled slowly. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this. He had walked in wanting nothing more than coffee and quiet. But respect, he knew, was something some men only learned through consequences. And as the leader cocked his fist back, grinning, convinced he was about to make an example out of a harmless stranger, Steven shifted his weight. Not in panic, not in anger, but with the calm precision of a man who had trained his entire life for moments exactly like this. The leader's fist hovered in the air for a heartbeat longer than necessary. He wanted the moment to stretch, wanted the room to see who was in charge. His grin widened as he leaned closer, confident, certain that fear would finally crack the quiet man standing in front of him. But Steven Seagal didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice, didn't step back, didn't beg. Instead, he spoke softly, almost sadly. "Walk away," he said. "You still can." The bikers laughed again, louder this time, but the sound felt forced. Something about the way Steven stood, balanced, relaxed, completely present, didn't match the role they had assigned him. The leader scoffed. "Too late for that." He swung. Fast, angry, sloppy. In the same instant, Steven moved. Not with brute force, but with timing. He turned slightly, letting the punch cut through empty air, and caught the biker's wrist with a grip so precise it felt like steel closing around bone. Before the leader could react, Steven twisted, not hard, just enough. There was a sharp crack. The leader screamed. The sound cut through the cafe like glass shattering. Gasps erupted from every corner. A chair tipped over. Someone yelled, "Oh my God!" The leader dropped to one knee, clutching his wrist, face twisted in disbelief and pain. He hadn't even landed a hit. "What the?" one biker shouted. Steven released the wrist and stepped back, hands open, palms relaxed. "I warned you," he said calmly. For a split second, no one moved. Then chaos exploded. Two bikers rushed him from the side, fists flying wildly. Steven shifted again. Small steps, subtle angles. He blocked one punch with his forearm, redirected another with a simple parry. One biker stumbled forward, off balance. Steven placed a foot behind the man's knee and applied gentle pressure to the shoulder. The biker hit the floor hard, the air leaving his lungs in a loud gasp. Another charged from behind. Steven turned, grabbed the attacker's jacket collar, and used the biker's own momentum to guide him straight into a table. Wood splintered. Plates crashed. Coffee spilled everywhere. The room erupted in screams. Customers scrambled toward the exits. The waitress ducked behind the counter, hands shaking. Phones were out now. No one was hiding it anymore. The leader staggered back to his feet, fury replacing shock. "Get him!" he roared. But the confidence was gone. They circled again, slower this time. Careful. The laughter had vanished completely, replaced by shallow breathing and darting eyes. Steven stood in the center, unmoving. His posture hadn't changed. His breathing was steady. It was as if the violence around him belonged to another world entirely. "You don't have to do this," he said, scanning their faces. "Not one of you." One biker lunged with a chair. Steven stepped inside the swing before it fully formed, grabbed the chair's back, and twisted. The biker lost his grip and fell backward, stunned. Steven didn't chase. Didn't celebrate. He waited. The leader wiped blood from his lip, staring at Steven with a mix of rage and confusion. "Who the hell are you?" he spat. Steven met his eyes. "Someone who's trained to end fights," he replied, "not start them." That answer landed heavier than any punch. The bikers hesitated now. They had expected fear. Resistance, maybe. Not control. Not discipline. One of them whispered, barely audible, "This isn't normal." Another glanced at the exits, calculating. Steven took a slow step back toward his table, signaling something they didn't expect, restraint. "This is your last chance," he said. "Leave. No one else gets hurt." The leader looked around at his men. One was still on the floor, groaning. Another held his ribs, eyes wide with shock. A third had backed up so far he was nearly against the wall. Pride screamed at him to continue. Instinct begged him not to. For the first time since they'd entered the cafe, the bikers felt it, the unmistakable realization that they had made a terrible mistake. Because this wasn't a weak man they could intimidate. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. And if they forced him to continue, they wouldn't be walking out the way they walked in. The cafe was silent, except for the groans of the fallen bikers and the occasional clatter of a tipped chair. Even the jukebox, which had been humming a quiet tune in the background, seemed to fade into the tension of the moment. Every eye in the room was locked on Steven Seagal, who now stood calmly near his table, hands relaxed at his sides, breathing steady as if nothing had happened. The leader, the last one standing, wiped a smear of blood from his cheek and took a step forward, trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. He had expected a scuffle, maybe a punch, but not this, a controlled, precise, almost effortless dismantling of his gang in seconds. Every instinct told him to retreat, but his ego screamed louder. "You think you've won?" the leader spat. "You're just one man." Steven tilted his head slightly, calm but piercing. "I am one man," he said softly. "But you are many, and you all made the same mistake. You underestimated me." The bikers looked around at each other, their bravado fading. Some were nursing bruises, others trying to shake off the shock. One of the younger members muttered, barely audible, Did he just—" "Yes," whispered another. "That's Steven Seagal." The word spread quickly through the group like wildfire. Recognition replaced arrogance with fear. This wasn't some random stranger. This was a martial arts legend. A man whose skill and discipline were the stuff of stories. Stories that now, in real life, were unfolding before their very eyes. Steven didn't advance. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried the authority of someone who had dedicated decades to mastering his craft. Every move he had made in the fight so far had been precise, efficient, and non-lethal, demonstrating skill without cruelty. That made the realization even more terrifying. If he had wanted to, he could have ended it all in an instant. The leader's hand twitched toward a knife strapped to his belt. The motion was small but instinctively threatening. Before he could draw it, Steven stepped forward with an economy of movement so natural it almost seemed slow, though there was nothing slow about it. With a single, subtle wrist motion, he disarmed the leader, twisting the knife out of his hand and sending it skittering across the floor. A collective gasp rose from the room. Even the other bikers froze, unsure whether to flee or stay. Their bravado had been stripped away, replaced by pure survival instinct. Steven stepped back to create space, maintaining eye contact with the leader. "I warned you," he said calmly. "Leave now. Walk out the door with your pride intact. Or stay, and learn what it means to underestimate someone." The leader's knees shook. He looked down at the floor, then around at his gang. Some were already retreating toward the exits, muttering apologies, others simply staring in disbelief, unable to comprehend the turn of events. The leader, pride wounded but survival instinct stronger, finally nodded. "We're leaving," he said, voice tight. "Good," Steven replied. He didn't smile. He didn't taunt. He simply watched them go, making sure every single one exited safely, their tails tucked, ego battered but bodies intact. The cafe began to breathe again. Customers slowly peered out from behind tables. Phones, which had been raised, were lowered. The waitress, shaking, placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of Steven. Are you okay?" she whispered, barely able to meet his eyes. Steven nodded. "I'm fine. But sometimes," he said softly, almost to himself, "arrogance blinds the eyes that should see." The tension that had gripped the cafe began to dissipate, replaced by awe. Patrons whispered to each other, recounting the precision, the calm, the power that had just walked through their space without a single unnecessary word. Even the old newspaper reader, who had been silently observing from the corner, shook his head. "I've never seen anything like that," he muttered. Steven returned to his seat, picked up his cup, and took a slow sip. Composed. In control. The bikers were gone, but the lesson they, and everyone else in the cafe, would remember for a lifetime had just been delivered. Because in that quiet, ordinary roadside cafe, everyone had witnessed a truth. True strength doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to threaten. It waits, disciplined and ready, for those who mistake silence for weakness. And for the first time, everyone in that room understood that the man in the black jacket was no ordinary traveler. He was a master. A legend. Someone who commanded respect not through words, but through action. The atmosphere had changed. The ordinary had become extraordinary. And outside, the world continued, unaware of the lesson that had just unfolded inside. The bikers had scattered down the highway, their engines echoing off the asphalt as they fled into the distance, leaving chaos in their wake. Inside the cafe, the tension still hung heavy, like smoke that refused to clear. Broken chairs, spilled coffee, and the remnants of fear were scattered across the floor. Patrons slowly emerged from their hiding spots, whispering in awe, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Steven Seagal sat calmly at his table, fingers wrapped loosely around his coffee cup. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't celebrated, hadn't even flinched once. The entire room seemed to revolve around the quiet authority of his presence. And then, almost imperceptibly, the whispers started. That's him, isn't it? No, it can't be. Yes, that's Steven Seagal." The murmurs spread like wildfire. Customers nudged one another, phones were pulled out, and some recorded the man whose calm had dismantled a gang of threatening bikers. Recognition flickered across faces, followed by astonishment. Even the waitress, hands still shaking, leaned over cautiously. I didn't know," she said softly. I knew your face, but—" Her words trailed off. Steven only smiled faintly, placing his cup back on the table. There was no arrogance in that smile. No need for validation. Just the quiet satisfaction of someone who had acted with precision and discipline, as he always did. At that moment, the cafe door swung open again. This time, it wasn't motorcycles or loud voices that announced the arrival. It was a sleek black car pulling up outside. 3 men in suits stepped in, holding documents and looking around with urgency. Their eyes locked on Steven immediately, and they approached him with a mix of respect and relief. "Mr. Seagal, we've been waiting for you, sir," one of them said, almost out of breath. The entire cafe froze. Patrons watched, confused and intrigued. The leader of the bikers, now out in the parking lot and looking back nervously, recognized the situation immediately. He had underestimated the man. They all had. And now the truth was impossible to ignore. "Wait. Mr. Seagal," someone muttered. You mean that's him? Yes, another whispered. The martial arts legend, the actor, the master. Steven nodded politely to the men in suits and gestured toward the bikers who had fled. They underestimated the situation, he said calmly. It was an opportunity to teach a lesson. The executives handed him a folder. Everything is ready, sir. The transfer is complete. You now have controlling interest. A stunned silence fell over the cafe. No one had expected this. This was no ordinary trip for coffee. This was the arrival of a man who not only commanded respect through skill, but also through power in ways most could not yet comprehend. Steven stood, closing the folder carefully. I came here simply to make a deposit, he said, voice steady. But now, I will also make some changes. The implications sank in. The bikers, the cafe patrons, everyone who had witnessed the earlier scuffle, they realized the full magnitude of the situation. The quiet man they had dismissed, mocked, and even physically challenged, was far more than he appeared. He was in control, not just of the fight, but of the broader game they had no idea they were part of. The waitress finally spoke, voice trembling. You're in charge. Steven nodded once, calmly. Yes. And from this moment forward, respect isn't just earned through fear. It's earned through humility, skill, and understanding. A hush fell over the cafe. People absorbed the words, realizing the weight behind them. There was no arrogance, no boasting, only truth. For the bikers who had fled moments before, the lesson would sting for a long time. They had come seeking to intimidate, to assert dominance, to spread fear. Instead, they had faced someone who combined calm discipline, unmatched skill, and authority far beyond their comprehension. And they had lost, not through brute force, but through the quiet power of preparation, control, and awareness. Steven adjusted his jacket, nodded to the remaining patrons, and walked toward the exit. His movement was measured, confident, and commanding. He had arrived for one reason, handled a threat, and left behind a lesson that would resonate far beyond the walls of the roadside cafe. And as the door closed behind him, everyone present understood a simple but profound truth. You never truly know the power of the person in front of you. Arrogance blinds, silence conceals, and respect must always be given, even when it seems unnecessary. Outside, the black car waited. Inside, the cafe buzzed with awe. And somewhere, down the highway, the bikers would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Because one man, quiet, composed, and in control, had shown them all the true meaning of strength. The tension in the cafe had finally begun to dissipate, but its effects lingered like the faint smoke from a fire that had just been extinguished. Broken chairs and spilled coffee remained as silent witnesses to the chaos, and the patrons, still wide-eyed, whispered among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Steven Seagal, however, remained calm, seated at his table as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The biker gang, humiliated and nursing their injuries, had scattered down the highway. Their engines echoed in the distance, a fading reminder of the confrontation. The leader, usually loud and commanding, had vanished into the crowd, muttering curses under his breath. His confidence, once unshakable, had been replaced by fear and disbelief. None of them could comprehend the quiet precision with which Steven had neutralized them, nor could they grasp the discipline behind his movements. Meanwhile, the executives who had arrived earlier with documents confirming his controlling interest in the bank watched Steven with a mix of respect and concern. They had come expecting a routine deposit, but what they witnessed was something far more revealing. This was a man whose skill and discipline extended beyond the ordinary, whose calm demeanor masked an authority few could challenge. Steven finally stood, closing the folder in his hands. He exhaled slowly, letting the air carry the remnants of tension from the room. The customers and staff watched in silent awe, realizing that the quiet man before them was not only in command of himself, but now also held power in ways they had yet to fully comprehend. The leader of the bikers, if he had known the truth, would have realized he was facing someone who could end conflict in seconds, but Steven had chosen restraint. That was what made him truly powerful. He didn't need to flaunt his abilities, and he didn't need to punish beyond what was necessary. He acted with intention, precision, and control. Turning to the staff, Steven spoke, his voice steady and commanding. Respect is not given because of fear or intimidation. It is earned through humility, skill, and understanding. Today, many of you witnessed the consequences of arrogance and the value of composure. He paused, scanning the room, letting his words sink in. The waitress, still shaking slightly, nodded. She had learned more in these past few minutes than years of ordinary life lessons could have taught her. Customers who had arrived expecting a simple coffee break left with a story they would tell for years, a story about discipline, strength, and respect. Then Steven's gaze shifted to a figure standing near the back of the cafe, the old clerk who had remained composed throughout the entire ordeal. Unlike the others, he had not panicked or joined in the whispers of fear. He had observed quietly, showing the kind of respect that did not depend on appearances or immediate rewards. "From this day forward," Steven said, pointing toward the clerk, "you will take on a greater responsibility here. You understand what it means to stay composed under pressure, and that is the quality I value most." The clerk's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and pride flooding his expression. I won't let you down, sir," he said. "I know you won't," Steven replied calmly. "And as for the rest of you," he added, addressing the remaining staff, "remember this lesson. True authority is silent, and true strength is controlled." He straightened his jacket and walked toward the door, every movement deliberate and confident. The patrons watched in awe as he left, understanding that the events of the past few minutes had delivered a lesson far deeper than any words could convey. Outside, the black car waited, engine humming quietly. Steven entered without fanfare. The executives followed, carrying the documents that cemented his authority. The cafe doors closed behind him, leaving the space eerily silent. Inside, the atmosphere had changed permanently. Where there had once been fear and uncertainty, now there was reverence and a newfound understanding. The lesson of the day was clear. Arrogance invites consequences, discipline commands respect, and composure in the face of chaos is a power far greater than brute force. The bikers, miles down the road, would remember this encounter not as a simple scuffle but as a defining moment. They had underestimated a man who required no weapons, no army, no noise to assert control. He had shown them, and everyone else, that strength is measured not in intimidation but in mastery over oneself. And for the patrons and staff of that ordinary roadside cafe, life would never feel ordinary again. They had witnessed a man who embodied discipline, humility, and authority all at once. Steven Seagal had walked through their lives quietly, leaving a mark far deeper than any physical impression, a lesson in power, respect, and the silent force of true mastery. The room exhaled collectively, understanding that sometimes the most powerful people do not need to fight. They need only to exist, calmly and resolutely, to remind the world of the strength that lies in discipline, respect, and self-control. The cafe, once alive with the hum of conversation and the clatter of dishes, now held a different energy. Patrons lingered, hesitant to leave, as if they were still processing what had just unfolded. The ordinary roadside coffee stop had become a stage for a lesson few would forget, a lesson in respect, discipline, and the quiet strength of a man who required no display of arrogance to command attention. Steven Seagal's presence lingered long after he had walked out. People whispered to one another, recounting the fight, the precision, the calm control that had dismantled a group of aggressive bikers in mere moments. They spoke in awe about the skill that had been contained within his quiet movements, the silent authority that had prevented needless harm while ensuring consequences were understood. Even the staff, who had initially feared for their safety, now understood a deeper truth. Respect is not demanded through threats, loud voices, or physical intimidation. It is earned. It is earned through discipline, humility, and the wisdom to act when necessary. The waitress, trembling yet inspired, glanced around the room. The spilled coffee, the broken chairs, the remnants of chaos, they all told the same story. Arrogance had a price, and composure had its rewards. She had watched a master at work, someone who embodied the principle that true strength is controlled, deliberate, and guided by awareness. The old clerk, now promoted to a position of responsibility, stood quietly near the counter. He had remained calm while everyone else panicked, observing without judgment, showing respect where respect was due. Steven's decision to reward him spoke volumes. It demonstrated that humility and integrity are noticed, even if the world around you is chaotic and loud. Outside, the bikers were far down the highway, replaying the encounter in their minds. Their arrogance had led them to challenge someone they perceived as weak, and they had been decisively proven wrong. The lesson was bitter but necessary. Underestimate a man by appearances, and you may find yourself facing consequences far beyond what you imagined. For Steven, the day had been simple. He had come for a coffee, encountered a threat, and responded in accordance with his discipline. He had shown that true power does not need to shout. It does not need to impress. It simply exists, and when the time comes, it acts with precision and purpose. This was the final takeaway for everyone who witnessed the event. Appearances can be deceiving, and judgment based on superficial assumptions can be dangerous. True respect is not reserved for those who intimidate or display wealth or status. True respect is given to anyone, at any time, because one day, the person you overlook could hold power far beyond your comprehension. In life, many people attempt to assert dominance through noise, bluster, or aggression. But as Steven demonstrated, control, patience, and mastery of oneself yield results far more lasting and meaningful. He did not seek revenge, nor did he crave recognition. He simply acted as someone who had trained his body, mind, and spirit to respond effectively, ethically, and with precision. The cafe patrons, staff, and even those who had fled, the bikers, would remember this lesson for a lifetime. It was not merely a story of a man defeating aggressors. It was a story of discipline, quiet authority, and the profound power of humility. As the doors of the cafe closed behind the last lingering customers, the lesson remained clear. Respect is a currency that can never be taken lightly. It must be earned through actions, observed in restraint, and given even when it seems unnecessary. Because the quiet, disciplined, and composed may hold more power than any brash display could ever convey. Steven Seagal had walked into a normal day, faced an extraordinary challenge, and left behind a story of power, respect, and humility. His example reminded everyone present that true strength is measured not by violence, but by control, not by fear, but by integrity, and not by appearances, but by skill and character. For those watching the story unfold, from the cafe, from afar, or on a screen, let it be a reminder: the world rewards patience, discipline, and respect. The quiet are often the strongest, and humility is far more powerful than arrogance. Type respect in the comments if you believe strength lies in calmness and humility. Share where you're watching from, and carry this lesson forward, because true power is silent, and true respect is earned, not demanded. The story ends here, but the lesson lasts forever.